Well, good afternoon, Heather.
Hey Bruce, how are you doing?
I am great. I am so excited about another recording, another episode, another conversation of Can I Have a Word with You, right? I mean, two people that just, I don't know, we're close to 30 episodes now where we just get together, we pick a word, we talk about how it can impact us in a challenging time or a awesome opportunity time or a setback time, and how if we focus on our words and how we speak to ourselves and how we kind of break this stuff down, how can we become stronger going through it and stronger as we come out of it. So for anyone that's joining for the first time, Bruce Pulver and Heather Carter, and we sit down and say, can I have a word with you? And spend 15 or 20 minutes and try to unpack one. So lots been going on with you. You've been traveling, you've been doing some workshops. Tell me a little bit about those so those that are on the program can kind of hear what you're doing and reach out to you.
Yeah, well, I just this year have started doing some interactive women's events. I call them Soul-Selfie soirees. And I found out that lots of people don't really know what that means. And so they change the title sometimes because they're unsure. But basically, it's just a party. So it's a little fun, usually a nighttime party. And I did a nighttime party, a Soul-Selfie soiree at Napa First Christian Church in Napa, California, where I'm from. I went to high school in Napa and got married on that same stage. So it was very surreal. My father in law, who has passed away in the last year, was the pastor there. And,
Wow.
you know, it was just a really special time to be able to be there with that specific church family. And it was just
Wow.
awesome. I loved
So if
meeting
someone,
them, and they were very excited and happy.
awesome. So if someone comes to a soiree, in a nutshell, what can they
Mhm.
expect and before they walk in, and what do you think many of them are like or they experience as they walk out?
Well, my goal for the evening is to really help us learn how to share our stories and use all of our stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly, to help other people get through the things that we've been through. I talk a lot about just sharing in the messy. During these events, I share my story. This I'll go first, so you feel safe to go next. So I go first for about a little more than an hour and a half. I told the people the other night that by the time I get done talking for an hour and a half, we're all going to want me to do what my daughter told me once when I think she was about 3. I had a friend over, and apparently I was monopolizing the conversation. Shocking, I know. But she looked up at me and said, "Stop, mom, play the quiet game by yourself." And so I figured, would want me to play the quiet game by the time I talk for an hour and a half. But I really, pack as much in as I can so that there's no wasted time. We get after it right away, get to the root of things, and then we get in groups, in small groups, and then I read a post of mine out loud on, let's say, resentment, and then they all talk about that around the table. And because I've just spent an hour and a half sharing and being vulnerable, then they feel safe to do that at their tables. So I think it's just a good model for and practicing, being real with each other and
Wow,
authentic.
powerful. And I know that it changes lives and it impacts folks because we're in this stage now where we do want to share more of our experience and be more verbal, right? Because we've been not able to be that for a couple of years in our lives, and by
Yep.
by being the one who steps up in line and raises their hand and says, "I'll go," uh,
Mhm.
has to create a comfortable setting for folks in kind of a circle of trust or a circle of understanding with folks. So thank you for doing that. And folks can find out more about that at heathercarterwrites.com if they're interested in their church or their group to kind of have you out there. So that's awesome. Proud
Yeah.
of you for that. Thanks for
Thank
stepping out
you.
and saying yes. And so we decided today that because you raised your hand and then you do 90
Mhm.
minutes and then you engage folks, we thought we'd unpack the word go first, or the two
Mhm.
words go first, because that has an awful lot of sort of initiative written around that. When I think of the word going first or go first, it's, the first one to dive into the pool, not knowing how cold the water is, or, the first one to, volunteer for something, or the first one to kind of step in and say, let me give it a try.
Mhm.
So I'll kind of break down how I wrote go first for this episode, and then we can maybe unpack each of those. So what I do, guys, is if you don't know, I write a word vertically, and it's called an acrostic message, and I just look at the letters of the word to try to define what that word or that phrase means and how I can apply it. If I'm struggling with something, or if I'm facing an opportunity or a great, door opens for me, I may look at a certain mindset word that helps me attack it, helps me face it, helps me kind of step myself off the ledge sometimes if I have to. So I looked at it this way: GO, right? FIRST. And the G in go first was gets us uncomfortable. So I found that, going first isn't always the easiest thing to do, or volunteering, or saying, I'll put myself in the ring for that. It definitely can be eye-opening and make us uncomfortable to start. Would you feel how would you feel about that? And what would you say about that, Heather?
Yeah. No, I think it's definitely, one of the things I talked about in our event the other night is that sometimes it feels like, well, what do you mean you'll go first? That seems almost rude, because, aren't we supposed to say, oh, go ahead, you go ahead, you go ahead, and be serving and that, and letting others go first. But the difference is, I guess it depends on where you're going. But if where you're going requires you to be brave or is threatening in any way, then people are actually relieved, like you said, to, yeah, you go ahead and test those waters. I think you're crazy, or I think it's freezing. I think it's scary wherever you're going, or it's dark in there. I don't want to go. Yeah, you go first. So sometimes people are relieved when you go first.
Yeah.
I know
Even
that,
if it's,
I've
yeah,
mentioned,
go ahead.
oh, I was saying, I've mentioned before, I go to a family, a recovery group for family members uh, of people who are in addiction, or loved ones, even if it's not family members. And one of the principles really is that when that's why people in those groups have sponsors. The idea is that when you get to your fourth step and you kind of puke out everything you've ever done, you don't do that until your sponsor tells their story and they
Mm.
tell you everything they've ever done. So by the time you tell yours, you're like, dang, mine's not that bad or not that
Yeah.
scary.
Yeah.
So you've modeled something and you've been willing to be brave and go first.
And so going first, the G of gets us uncomfortable, can also help make others feel comfortable. Maybe they're
Mhm.
just waiting for someone to go first. So just a thought there on the G. The O is, man, it opens us up to risky. There's if you, it could go anywhere, right? I
Mhm.
mean, if you just step in and don't have any framework, any context, and just say, I'm going first, it could be a real risky situation for someone, right?
I think that, deep down, we're all afraid that we will share our heart, bare our soul with somebody, and they will go, okay, well, good luck with all that, and run out of the room and never call you again. So I think there's definitely fear that comes from sharing and going first, putting yourself out there.
Yeah, and it's not easy to be okay with that. But
Mm-hmm.
again, coming like we say, we unpack words, and maybe there's something at the end that we become stronger, we become more connected with the community,
Mm-hmm.
even if it was uncomfortable to start. So the F I put is going first. One way to go first is to find a way to engage.
Mm-hmm.
We have a dear friend, Bill Schomburg.
Mm-hmm.
who we've talked about a couple of times on this show, who's actually the gentleman that introduced Heather and I.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he says is we all have something in common. And one of those things is we're all connected to the fact that we are broken in some way, right? We are
Mm-hmm.
imperfect. I mean, we do base this podcast on our faith as well. And that's something that we really
Mm-hmm.
agree with and pay attention to, is that we have weaknesses, we have struggles, we are less than perfect. And that's maybe something we have in common with. So if you're willing to go first, think about a way to engage in a common way, not to celebrate our problems, right? But in a
Mm-hmm.
way to align and have compassion and some sort of empathy, and that you're sharing something that you have, and maybe there's something there that you can tie that's common. Like, I don't know about you, Heather, but man, we all struggle with some things, and one of the things that I'm struggling with now is, and then you've
Mm-hmm.
aligned that there's a struggle, right? And then yours is just a different one than someone else's. And I bet as you go through that and find common ground and work towards solutions, you then have found a way to engage. So that's the F. What are your thoughts around that? Do you find that when you go first, that there's a way that you're finding ways for folks to align with you and say, yeah, I can relate to her?
Oh yeah. In fact, one of the things I talk about in my event in my talk about going first is that actually several years ago I had a conversation with my husband because I'd been with some friends, and it was clear after a while that they all knew something about each other that I didn't know. And I realized that they were having side conversations without me. And my husband said, well, have you ever shared any of your brokenness or messiness with them? And I was like, no. And he said, you're going to have to decide if you want real, authentic relationships and friends, or if you want them to just, we're going to talk about this in a future podcast about our ego. Are you just going to keep your mouth shut so that they keep thinking that you've got it all together? Or do you want to be real? And to be honest, at the time, I was like, I think I'd rather have them think that I've got everything figured out. Thank you very much. So it took some really hard stuff in my world to be willing to lead with my brokenness instead of here's all the ways that I'm succeeding in things.
Yeah, let's just talk about all the awesome stuff that's going on in my life, right?
Yeah.
And that's a real good way to close folks off, because that's you know yeah, it's nice to celebrate, right? When
Mm-hmm.
like you've had some great trips recently and done some great
Mm-hmm.
conferences and great soirees, and that's great, and it's love chatting about those things. But deep connections deeply come from where we have come through or are going through
Yeah.
challenges, which we all have, right? So the I in first is it could save a life by going
Mm-hmm.
first, was what I thought about there, because you never know what someone is going through. You've never spent a day in someone's head. You've never spent a
Mm-hmm.
day typically in the four walls of their house or in their job,
Mm-hmm.
or what things are impacting them. So that going first could open someone up to the opportunity to speak where the pressure and the stress could be at a tipping point.
Oh, absolutely. I was trying to look. Sorry, I'm cheating. I have some notes here because pretty much everything we're talking about, which I love that how God kind of put those words in your mind, and they're all the exact things I just have a bunch of notes about. But there's a really neat quote that I was trying to find about that exact thing, that basically it's from a recovery standpoint, but it talks about how I'll just paraphrase it, but that we have to remember that our darkest past can be the thing that gives light and hope to others.
Yeah.
That it can literally save their life and save your life by sharing those dark places, because other people need to hear that so that they feel like they're not alone in their struggles,
Yeah.
and there's always hope.
Right. Yeah, I think if folks take this podcast and activate it and decide they're going first, we might have folks breaking in line, wanting to
Yeah.
get to the front of the line. So because
Yep.
there are so many positive things there. The R in first, go first. to me was rekindle a relationship. So, the
Mm,
olive branch, or reaching out and saying, hey, there's a whole um, couple of methods, or several of them, about apologizing for something, right? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. What can I do to improve the situation? I mean, just the three statements of an apology, but that could be all it takes to, I'm gonna say, put a relationship back to where it was, because maybe it was designed with that situation
mhm,
so that you have a different relationship, but it could rekindle it. Maybe it's a different
mhm,
kind of relationship, or a different, maybe it's at a different level or at a different perspective. I'll never forget a deep conversation I had with someone who was a very good conversationalist, and I asked them, kind of, talk to me about that, and he said, well, there's really three types of conversations. There's conversations about people, there's conversations about things, and there's conversations about ideas. He goes, I prefer the conversations about ideas, because they can get so deep, they can get so healing, they can get so restorative, they can get so inspiring. So, I mean, it could rekindle a relationship that allows you to get to a different level of conversation just by going first, if there's a struggle or something that needs to be kind of unraveled.
mhm. Yeah, and I like the idea of the forgiveness, and or apologizing. That's huge. Nobody's willing, I shouldn't say nobody, but we're always waiting for someone to come and say they're sorry to us,
Yeah.
instead of looking, where have you hurt somebody? You know, um, that's a huge one. That's a
Yeah.
big piece.
Well,
Hmm.
even, don't you think, if you feel like you've been hurt, the forgiveness helps you more than it does the person that may not even know that what they said, or how they or something that impacted you. It's almost like, I just have to kind of let it go. And one way of
Hmm.
doing that is to forgive. And biblically, we
Hmm.
are all been forgiven, and with a grace beyond anything that we could possibly earn. So, for me, and I'm not perfect at this by any stretch of the imagination, but thinking about that, how can I live more like that? How can I forgive first and
Hmm.
go first?
Hmm.
So, and then the S kind of fits in here with the last letter, rekindle the relation. The S is set the table for growth. I mean, I remember, and this isn't necessarily in relationships, but I remember going to an improvisational comedy night, and I just love that. I just love the creativity of an idea and seeing it evolve. And they asked, the comedians asked for someone to come up on stage and sit in a chair, and they were going to make that person part of the skit. And I'm like, yes, and I just went up and did it. I mean, I just did it, and I was put in a very uncomfortable situation, not knowing kind of what to do. But man, I
Hmm.
grew out of that. It gave me
Yeah.
some confidence to toss an idea, or not squelch my own thoughts, thinking, oh, this isn't enough. This isn't going to be anything they can use. And I grew. So sometimes when you go
Hmm.
first, you're cutting the path. It's like reading a piece of music the first time. You only sight read it once. And you can only be in sight read mode for a piece of music one time, and that's the first time. And that's
Hmm.
where so much growth happens, because after that, you're repeating it and you're tweaking it and you're modifying it. So it could set the table for growth, I believe, when you go first. And I bet you see that when you do your talk and you're out
Yeah.
there growing, even if the topic is similar or the content is the same, you've
Yeah.
got to be growing every time you go first.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is always a little intimidating, and you're worried about, for a minute. It gets easier the more times you do it. So that's what you're saying too. Is like, if you practice going first, it gets a little less scary every time, because then you've had enough confirmation that what you are saying is not going to be the end of the world. And you also realize that even when you're going somewhere scary, you didn't die. Usually you don't die. You know what? You made it through. So, all the things you thought you'd never make it through, you've been through 100% of them. And here you are.
Yeah.
So it makes us less fearful to do it again if we remember that.
So this just jumped in my head real quick, and I agree with you. You know, just makes you more comfortable to say I'll go first again.
Mhm.
But once you have the experiences enough times of going first, um, I have found that encouraging someone else to step in is actually another way to grow. So let's, someone else to go. It's sort of relinquishing you. I can't explain how it's going to feel to you
Mm.
after you've gone first to
You just
someone,
have
and
to try it.
yeah,
Just
and
try
helping them grow. So the T then
it.
for me in go first is take a risk and go first. Like the challenge to the listener is if there's something you're facing, if there's something that you'd like to engage or initiate,
Mhm.
waiting on someone to sometimes is the respectful thing. I get that. But if
Mhm.
it's really on your heart that there's something I need to mend, there's an opportunity I need to step in, God's putting something in my heart. The other way I looked at this was go first and figure it out later,
Mhm.
as opposed to waiting. The first thing sometimes you should
Yeah.
do is go, whether you're first in line or you're going before you do
Yeah.
anything else first. Yeah. Wow. Well, I love this word, Heather. Go first.
I know. It can be a word, and then it can be an hour and a half talk. if you
Yeah.
and because there are so many nuances, this is just scratching the surface of this idea that what it might be like if I go first. And then there's a lot to unpack on that, and we're going to do some of that in some future podcasts here. But yeah, I
Absolutely.
think just taking that risk. What my life verse is a paraphrase of the verse that talks about how praise be to God, the God of all comforts, who comforts us in all our affliction, so we can help comfort others in theirs. It's a longer verse than that, but my paraphrase, I think I've mentioned before, is you go through what you go through so you can help others get through what you went through.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
we can't help other people get through what we went through if we don't tell them what that was, or at least maybe not the details. It doesn't have to be the nitty gritty, dirty details, but it can be enough of what we learned,
Yeah.
where we were, what happened, and where we are now and what we learned from it. And
Yeah.
that's going to require us to be brave and be willing to go first much
And
of the
and
time.
God asks us to be willing, and He asks us to be available. So if
Mm-hmm.
if we can work on those things, which I try to do on a regular basis, then
Mm-hmm.
if I become available, going first is sort of a step sometimes there. So
Mm-hmm.
making yourself available so that someone can come to you and you can speak life into them. So
Right.
we'll bring this down. HeatherCarterWrites.com for all of her amazing content, her book, how to reach her, for her programs and her talks and all of that. And Above the Chatter, OurWordsMatter.com for me, for my book, Above the Chatter, Our Words Matter. Mindset messages at Above the Chatter, Bruce Pulver. I write one every weekday, the same way we talk about today. So, Heather, as always, it's so great to share time with you. I look forward to it every week. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Can I Have a Word with You?
Yeah.
Till then,
Bye,
see you, everybody.
everyone.
Bye bye.